Over the last week, we have seen protests pop up in all 50 states. This is over the newest instance of police killing unarmed people, unarmed black people specifically. And it was spurred really by the death of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin, who knelt on his neck, depriving him of blood flow and killing him. So now a lot of the protests in response to this have been peaceful, but were met with overwhelming force by police officers. Places like New York, Seattle, LA. There are curfews in a lot of cities, Washington, D.C. As well. And the reason, of course, that we've had such a pushback to nonviolent protests done primarily by African Americans and white allies and, leftists and all that is because that kind of protest is no longer protected in America. And really, there are people in power that want to stop that. Now, notice how there wasn't this kind of reaction from the anti-lockdown, anti-stay-at-home protesters that were primarily right-wing. And that's because those who are trying to shut down these protests are right-wing. And so let me give you some examples of some laws that have been pushed by conservatives and by corporations, corporate America, to try to stop peaceful protest in this country. Louisiana lawmakers, for example, recently voted overwhelmingly to pass legislation that would crack down on peaceful protest. The bill would set a 3-year mandatory minimum prison sentence with hard labor for protesters convicted of trespassing on fossil fuel and infrastructure sites during a state of emergency. Right now, thanks to coronavirus, COVID-19, we are in a state of emergency. And so, but the thing, though, is that they can arbitrarily declare a state of emergency in order to crack down on protests. So no protests against fossil fuels, no protests like Keystone XL, no protests like we had against Dakota Access. So, in fact, they have taken a lot of the tactics from Standing Rock and they've really applied them against Black Lives Matter protests. And we've seen almost everything except for water cannons. Now, again, the anti-stay-at-home protests, they haven't done anything about those. You had pictures of people literally screaming in cops' faces. They do nothing. But then there's video of a 75-year-old man, white guy, getting shoved by a police officer because he was in the officer's way. And all these different videos that have come out from these protests of police behaving incredibly badly. And so overwhelmingly, peaceful protest, according to the article, has been criminalized since 2015. In the wake of protests set off by the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, states have introduced at least 154 bills or executive orders to restrict peaceful protests. Now, I thought that, of course, according to conservatives, if the protesters were just peaceful, then that would be fine and we would support them and they could do whatever they want as long as they keep it peaceful. No, not anymore. No. This is according to a HuffPost analysis of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Laws Tally, a new report from PEN America, and interviews with free speech experts. So they have really, according to these people, have been cracking down on nonviolent, peaceful protest. So far, 54 of those bills or executive orders have become law. More than 24, including the Louisiana measure, is still pending, awaiting the governor's signature. So it has already passed through the different chambers of Congress. Now, what's interesting, again, this isn't the result of violent protest. No. Most of the protesters condemn violent protests. In fact, you've had instances of violent protest being perpetrated by right-wing infiltrators and agent provocateurs trying to make the protests look bad. And again, which the majority of peaceful protesters are against. They're like, hey, what's going on here? They're even warning about mysterious pallets of bricks just kind of being there, just kind of showing up as like an invitation to like, hey, use me, to try to make the protests go violent or doctrine of vandalism, which of course would then justify a heavy-handed police presence. Ironically, though, according to these experts, a proliferation of new restrictions could push future protesters to embrace more combative tactics as the legal risk of peacefully protesting rise. So, the more you try to push back and you try to criminalize it, the more they're going to get like, okay, you want to criminalize peaceful protests? Oh, then we'll give you a non-peaceful protest. Dana Fisher, sociologist who studies protest movements at the University of Maryland, says there's a multiplier effect. If people don't think they're allowed to peacefully protest, they're going to be prepared for more confrontational protests. Now, look, that's not saying that the protesters will intentionally start smashing things up. It means they're ready to fight against the cops if the cops come at them, if the cops bring this violence. And they have been. And these laws are ensuring that they will be police violence. In fact, of the 22 anti-protest laws passed over the last 4 years, 12 designated fossil fuel sites as critical infrastructure and ramped up penalties for trespassing or tampering with equipment there. So that right there is basically saying if you're trying to protest a fossil fuel project like a pipeline, which could put people in danger, you're not allowed to do that. We're going to criminalize that, and we're going to come after you. We're going to impose incredibly harsh penalties against you if you dare, because that's critical infrastructure. Well, you know what else is critical? The climate. We kind of need that to live, right? And so now the statutes promoted in state legislators by the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council, that's ALEC, following the 2016 Dakota Access Pipeline protests, typically elevated low-level misdemeanor charges to felonies with thousands of dollars in fines and prison time. Louisiana has such a statute now, and lawmakers just last week expanded the measure, adding a mandatory minimum sentence that could send peaceful protesters to prison for standing near any of Louisiana's 125,000 miles of pipe. So now, the thing about that, it's already bad, right? What makes it worse is that police, since a lot of these pipelines are buried, could say, oh, look, you're standing close to a pipeline, you're protesting, oh, we're going to do the harsh penalties now, when you might not even know you're near a pipeline. So that's disastrous, right? Now, the Louisiana bill proposes incredibly inflexible penalties, but you have other states that have done something similar, but not quite as bad as Louisiana. So congratulations, Louisiana. You're number one for the worst anti-protest bills. However, Kentucky, South Dakota, and West Virginia passed new laws recently restricting fossil fuel protests back in March. And in Alabama, lawmakers advanced their bill in May, but failed to pass it before the legislative session ended. So it's kind of interesting to see West Virginia on this, right? So now, look, a lot of people are like, oh, West Virginia is a conservative country. In reality, they have a huge history of being pro-labor and anti-coal company. I mean, you guys read up on some of the history in West Virginia. It's really interesting. You had a labor movement. You had a literal rebellion, an armed insurrection by members of a labor union. These were the mine workers, and they assaulted police officers, coal company headquarters, sheriffs. You had like deputies, militiamen that were fighting against the union members. And a lot of these union members, by the way, were World War I veterans. They had their Springfield rifles. And so they brought those. 10,000 people were marching through the mountains. And, you had the Battle of Blair Mountain that happened in 1921, which saw, again, thousands of people armed with machine guns. They were shooting at each other. You had planes flying with tear gas, privately chartered planes with tear gas and pipe bombs filled with like shrapnel. It was about a war. It was the largest armed uprising since the Civil War. And this happened because labor union members were tired of getting screwed over by the company. Remember, this is a time where companies own the housing. And so if you even thought about creating a labor union or a labor movement or doing a strike, you would get evicted from your house because the company owned your house. They own pretty much everything. Company store, company house, all that stuff. Basically owned your life. And so this happened in West Virginia. They were tired of it. They got sick of it, and they did an armed rebellion. So I am kind of surprised that West Virginia is cracking down. But then again, when you look at how pervasive money in politics is today, maybe it's not such a surprise that you have West Virginia in the state that it is. And of course, nowadays the fight isn't quite for labor. I mean, you barely have any labor union representation at all in America anymore. But this fight's also about climate change. And so so it is different, of course, than that, because it does affect people's livelihoods. If we shut down the coal companies, then where are people going to work? Unless we give them alternatives, unless we up the standard of living, up the pay for other companies or for other professions, and really kind of revitalize the area with solar plants and things like that. But we haven't done that. And so it is a different fight, but I thought the history of that was really, really fascinating. But anyway, these critical infrastructure bills for coal companies and oil companies and all that, they passed due to money in politics. And probably one of the biggest, most egregious examples of legislation against peaceful protest, to switch over to another thing, is traffic bills, where in some of these states, 7 states, for example, had proposed legislation limiting liability for people who run over protesters. Block the street, they'll allow you to run people over. That's horrible. These bills also sought to increase penalties for protesters who block traffic or gather without approval on private or public land. The latter measures became the law in 2 states. So, in 2017, you had South Dakota that had a law that enabled the governor and sheriffs to ban gatherings of more than 20 people on public land if the gathering could damage the land or the renter's use of the property. It also gave the State Department of Transportation the right to bar protests that interfere with highway traffic, increasing the penalties for obstructing roadways to 1 year behind bars and a $2,000 fine. So, look, there's plenty more examples of ways that they've tried to stop peaceful protest. Now, there's another type of anti-protest bill, and this is pushed by the right wing as well, and that's the college campus bill, right? Proposed laws to punish students or universities for protests that block controversial speakers from appearing on campus are pending in 6 states and were defeated in another 11. So this is like the Dave Rubin type of bill. Like, oh, I can't believe you wouldn't allow Dave Rubin to go on campus. No, Dave Rubin can go on campus. Just expect a bunch of people to protest against it because they don't want to hear what Dave Rubin has to say. Look, for me, I say let him speak to like the 3 people in the audience that are like, yeah, free speech, right? But I wouldn't criminalize protest against it because guess what? Protest is also their free speech. You know, if you believe in free speech, then you'd be like, well, they can protest, and then also Dave Rubin can try to speak through that protest, or Milo Yiannopoulos, or whoever, Ben Shapiro, or whatever. But you know what's funny is that they're even blocking, these colleges are now blocking left-wing speakers from going and speaking on campus. We're the free speech warriors on that. Anna Kasparian told a story on the Young Turks where she was denied a speaking gig because right-wing people didn't want her. So they just didn't even invite her. What happened? What happened? I thought you believed in free speech. So, and speaking of free speech, right? There's a law in Utah that would punish silent protest. The law was enacted 3 months ago and expanded what is disorderly conduct. In the legislature, legislature or at meetings of government officials. And it expanded it to include creating, quote unquote, annoyance or alarm with unreasonable noise. Well, now, wait a minute. If you're silent, you're not creating unreasonable noise, right? Well, they expanded that to include that if an officer is yelling at you to get out and refuses to comply with the lawful order of a law enforcement officer to move from a public place or an official meeting, or knowingly creates a hazardous or physically offensive condition. So if you're silent, but you got a cop yelling at you to get out and you don't do it, well, guess what? You have just created unreasonable noise with your silence. Get out. The measure mandates a $750 fine for first offenses, up to 3 months in jail for those who have been warned to cease the prohibited conduct of just sitting in the room being silent, and up to 1 year in jail for a third-time offender. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. And then, of course, you had action against BDS, right? The boycott and divest movement for Israel. Boycott, divest, and sanction on Israel for their treatment of Palestinians. So now you had a lot of states, 32 states enacted measures to restrict or formally condemn as anti-Semitic support for BDS. That's insane. 24 of those laws and executive orders bar states from granting contracts to companies or individuals who support BDS. That's literally using capitalism to say we don't support what Israel is doing in relation to Palestine, to the Palestinian people, to the occupation that's going on. So all of that, understand that your ability to picket, protest, silently, peacefully, and all of that is actually literally under assault in this country and has been in a lot of states for quite some time. So, I mean, what about where are the free speech warriors on this? Where are the people that are, have stockpiled arms against a government that is tyrannical? Isn't stopping your American right to protest tyranny? No, those people, look, all of those people who are not out there, who, profess to be free speech warriors and pro-Constitution, that are not out there protesting against this police state that we have, you're frauds. You're just cosplaying a constitutionalist. You're cosplaying a patriot. Not real at all. No, you're caping for the powerful because guess what? They agree with you and you agree with them and you can't wait to lick the boot. And the powerful are doing this, of course, because they don't want the status quo to change, because they love the status quo because it really serves them. And so that's why you're seeing all these laws that criminalize peaceful protest. And, if they do that, again, I mentioned that earlier in the story. If you start criminalizing and you're successful with criminalizing peaceful protest, well, then what you're going to do is going to create the conditions for violent protest. Hey, guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.